My biggest goal in life was to bring something to the table that didn't just feel like, oh, yeah, my mom died of an overdose and was a drug addict, because she was so much more than that. And that's something I really care about is helping people understand that they are human beings. And no matter if they're homeless or end up in prison or end up overdosing or find recovery and live a long, healthy life with their family, there's a reason behind drug use.
Welcome back to episode 3 of Kids of Overdose, the show where we hear personal stories from people who have lost a parent to drug overdose and addiction. I'm your host, Candace, and in this episode, I talked to Hayley, who lost her mom to a lifelong battle of addiction. I found her article in Business Insider talking about it. What I love about this conversation is not just that Hayley has an interesting journey with her grief process. Spoiler alert, there is a psychic involved, but she learned a lot of facts about addiction itself that has helped her understand things better along the way. And she shares that valuable insight with us. So here we go. Thank you again for listening to Kids of Overdose.
My name is Hayley Folk. I am a relationships writer. I write primarily about sex, relationships, and dating, all through the lens of personal essays. So I write for brands like Cosmopolitan, Women's Health, Business Insider, Refinery 29. And I started writing about sex and relationships, but as my career sort of took off, I was able to write about some more personal things. So I started doing some addiction and advocacy work for publications like Business Insider. And then I wrote an article for Pop Sugar about how Buffy the Vampire Slayer helped me to grieve the death of my mother. And then I started getting into writing about death in general and what that's like. And so I've been a freelance writer for, I would say, about 8 years now. And it was always my dream to write and also do something that was meaningful and impactful to other people. And I only discovered it pretty much in the past 4 years that I could write about this personal experience and help other people.
Tell us about your mom and what was she like?
So my mom she lived to be 45 years old. So she was fairly young, just like your dad. And she was probably the feistiest person I've ever met. She took no shit from anybody. Super funny, super charismatic, incredibly kind. And on the opposite end, in the worst of her addiction, she could be incredibly mean as well, which happens a lot for addicts. And I always say, like, there is duality there. I personally don't look at her with rose-colored glasses because I think it's easy to do that when someone has
Yeah.
passed away. But our relationship was very complicated in a lot of ways. And I feel very lucky that I can see her both as the good person that she was and also acknowledge the stuff that she had that was maybe not so desirable or good to be around was just from her addiction. But she struggled for a very long time with her addiction. She was struggling with methamphetamine use. She started using when she was 13 years old and
Oh,
then
wow.
used until she was 45 and passed away.
Was this something that you anticipated would happen?
Yes. So, to give some context, we were estranged for 11 years before she overdosed. And that was in part that she just didn't choose to go to rehab, or she tried to get better and then couldn't, and went to rehab after rehab and just couldn't. It never stuck. And I had to make the decision to walk away from the relationship. And, I was in my teens when that happened. So I lived from, like, I think I was 13 onward until 23. It was something I always anticipated because I knew that her drug use had gotten more and more significant. And it was always bad. Like, I would say throughout my entire childhood, it was pretty bad. She went to prison a few times. She was homeless. She went in and out of rehab facilities. There was a point when she was clean for 3 years consistently when I was 10 to 13. And that was probably the best time for us in terms of our relationship. But I always anticipated this. I think I just expected it to be when I was a lot older
Oh.
and not when I was 23.
Why do you think your mom started using drugs so young?
I I think it was a lot of things, but I think primarily her mom was a drug user and was a single mom. And she was giving drugs to my mother when she was 13. And some of that was, you know, her mother had no context for how to be a mother and just knew that her lifestyle was her lifestyle. And she started intertwining my mom in that lifestyle very young. So my mom had no rules growing up. She had no structure. She didn't have a parent that was reliable enough to really tell her, like, you should and should not do these things. And so she tried it when she was 13. And then as she got more into her teenhood, she started hanging out with people who were regularly doing drugs who were older than her. So she was probably hanging out with people in their mid 20s to late 30s, and she was 14 or 15, and they were all using meth. It spiraled in a way because at that point, she didn't have a strong figure to step in and help her.
When she ended up passing, you had said that you hadn't been talking to her for like 11 years at that point. So how
Mhm.
did you find out?
It was really strange. I'm someone who believes in like the greater universe. I don't believe in a God, but I believe in the universe, and I think that everything happens in timing, and the way that it happens is not always just like a coincidence. And I actually saw my mom for the first time in 11 years, a week to the day before she passed away. And we hadn't seen each other in person at all. We had talked on the phone a few times, and like I think she had sent me some letters over the years, but we hadn't seen each other. And as fate would have it, her dad passed away, and we went to the funeral. And because of the nature of her illness and how she lived her life, my family didn't want her at the funeral. And I reached out to her and told her on Facebook, like, hey, your dad is dying, an aggressive cancer. It was very sudden for her. And she showed up. And so I saw her there. And it was a very strange experience because she looked a lot older and I looked a lot older. And she wasn't, I knew that she was clean, like on that day. Like she sobered up to come to this. It was obvious. And so I got to interact with her for like an hour. And then a week later, my dad called me and said, hey, your grandma called and your mom passed away. And it was literally a week to the day of the time that I saw her. I got the information pretty quickly from my dad.
So it's almost like you were able in some kind of way to say goodbye, even though you didn't know you were saying goodbye.
Yeah. And it was, I don't know, the more time that passes, because this was almost 6 years ago now, the more I'm like, wow, this feels like divine timing. And it feels like there was a reason that I was able to see her and sort of have a not negative perspective of her when I saw her. It was, you grow up with an addict parent and you're told a lot of things by people who know that your parent is an addict. There's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of feelings from other family members that are negative.
What were they saying to you? Like,
Growing up, I was always told that my mom was a problem, that she wasn't going to get better, that she was a manipulator, that she was not good for me to be around. And I think some of that to an extent was true, but I think that it completely negated all of the positive aspects of who she was as a human being. So when I found out about her passing away, I had a very intense reaction that I think that came from that almost. Like I wasn't allowed to grieve the relationship we had in our lives, let alone grieve her dying.
so then when you did find out, did a lot of that emotion come out?
It did. It was, I think I had held on to the grief of like the relationship we could have had for my whole life. So I always thought when she passed away that I would be like kind of prepared because when you
Okay.
grow up in this space, you're like, oh, I'll know what I'm going to feel. I'll know what I'm going to say. I'll know exactly what to do. That all completely went away. Like I found out it was a morning. It was like the very first thing in the morning. And I remember I had a brand new puppy, so I was taking him outside to go to the bathroom, and I looked at my phone and my dad had called me like 5 times. And it was like 5:30 in the morning. So I knew something was up and I called him and he had told me, and I think I just like screamed kind of, which I think is now I know a natural reaction to like finding something like this out, but I just couldn't believe it. I had all of this denial, and then I felt like initially I didn't have a space to feel what I needed to feel because it was so big. And I had just seen her. So I think that compounded a lot of stuff too. Like it was almost like, oh my God, I just saw her. How could this be? Like, I don't think this is real. And another component too, I think, is that when you're estranged from a parent for as long as I was, it almost felt like we were just still estranged and she wasn't gone. And that added a really complicated level to how I felt about her passing.
And over time, how has it changed? Did you go to therapy, or were there certain things that you had to do to help you?
Yeah, so I didn't go to therapy for a long time. And I think I was avoiding talking about it for sure. As I said, my family was kind of, they weren't doing this in like trying to be a negative way or like malicious to me, but there was definitely moments where I felt like they didn't want me to talk about how I felt about her because it was too painful for them to hear, especially my dad, who has since grown and we talk about her a lot. And there's like layers to their relationship too that were really complicated. But I felt like I could finally at some point let myself go to therapy and have a moment to really understand like what would it feel like to grieve and why am I so scared of it? Because it felt really scary. Like it's a very complicated process and it's a lot of feeling and emotion and it feels like times early on in the grieving process it feels impossible. And so I started going to therapy and I went to therapy for 6 months solidly every single week, twice a week. And I was really lucky because I had moved from California to New York and I had kind of just started to pursue becoming a writer, like a real freelance writer. And I joined an MFA program. And at the MFA program, they had free therapy for students. And I was like, so I can do this and also like not pay a ton of money to do this. And it sounds weird, but that was sort of an incentive for me of like, okay, I can do this and not have to worry about the financial aspect too. I think more and more things in my life started to happen related to my grief that I didn't realize were happening at the time because of it. Like I was just going through a lot of stuff. I was struggling, I was going through a divorce, I was not really talking to my family that much, and all of that was compounded because I couldn't let myself feel these things. And I remember going into therapy and saying, this is the goals that I have. Like, I want to let myself grieve. I want to let myself not be angry at her anymore for her choices and her mistakes and the illness that she had. And I also wanted to be able to talk about her without feeling like I was a burden to other people or that I couldn't talk about her at all.
You had mentioned that your family didn't really like you talking about her that much. So maybe that too is like you didn't know how to talk about her or how other
Mhm.
people would feel. What
Yeah.
about talking to people outside your family? Because you were 13, you were so young, and your mom had been like this for a long time. Did you ever tell anybody about your mom growing up, or were you afraid to?
I, I did. I did tell people my entire childhood before 13, my mom was in and out of prison. She was doing drugs with friends. She was living in weird places and on and off, we had visitation together, court ordered. So there was always moments in life where she was around, but then there would be moments where she wasn't around at all. And I never knew. My primary caregivers were my dad and my grandma, and they would really kind of shelter me in ways from knowing what was going on. Kids pick up on it. They know eventually. And I would tell my friends at school, like, oh, my mom's not around. She doesn't live with me because she's not well, or I just knew she wasn't healthy. And then as I got older, especially when my mom got really sick and then ended up going to rehab and she was clean for 3 years, I was able to open up to friends and teachers at that point in ways that I had never before because my mom and I started to build a really wonderful relationship. She got clean and we hung out every week together. We had every other weekend visitations, and on Wednesdays she would pick me up from after school and we would have like a dinner together and my sister would be there too. So it was a really nice time. And I felt like it was the first time in my life that I was able to share with my best friends what was going on. And I think it came from a place of, oh, my mom's doing better now, so I can tell them. And it's not as like Not that it was ever embarrassing, but I guess I was always worried people wouldn't understand.
And do you think that this type of experience has changed you in any way or influenced you in how you live now or the choices that you've made?
Absolutely. The way that I have lived my life in the past 6 years is like I've fast forwarded in a way. Like I've done so many things that I've wanted to do in my life. I've traveled. I remarried someone who is amazing. I left an abusive relationship that I was in when my mom passed away, and her passing away really like pushed me to leave. When I saw her for the last time, my ex-husband was there and she met him, and I could tell she was not interested in him. Like
Oh,
I could tell she was a little annoyed by him, and she didn't know anything about him. But like after her passing away, I started to be like, why am I here? Why am I like wasting my time in a relationship that is like so unhealthy and toxic for me? And I deserve to go and live my life to the fullest. And the year after she passed away, I moved to New York by myself. I left an abusive relationship. I um, found friendships in a way that I had never had before. I started therapy exactly a year after her passing away. I ended up in a really wonderful relationship with someone new who I'm now married to. And I also, another really huge thing is I completely embraced who I am in my sexuality. I'm bisexual, and I think before her death, I just wasn't accepting of myself and I wasn't accepting of the relationship style that I wanted. I'm polyamorous. And so after she passed away, I started talking to my dad more about my sexuality and like people who were close to me. And he told me that my mom was bisexual and that she was also
oh.
polyamorous. And I never knew that.
You
It
had
was
a
what
lot more in common than you thought.
yeah, and it's interesting. Like when you go 11 years without speaking to someone, you think, oh, I don't know anything about them. But then time passes and you realize that you're so similar. And so my partner now always says that he watched me kind of do more in 1 year for myself than most people do in 10 years. And I started doing things in a way that really pushed me forward to become not only a better version of myself, but also to give my mom a legacy that she didn't have otherwise. One of the big things that I've wanted to do and that I started working on after her death is I chose to go to an MFA program in creative writing at the New School. And my purpose for going there was literally so that I could write a book about my mom.
Wow.
And I started writing it. It was a 2 year program and it was during COVID and it was all online. And I started writing it and really came out like feeling like I had done something good. And as of yesterday, I completely finished the book.
Wow,
So
congratulations.
thank you. I feel like without this experience, I would have never been able to do it.
And she gave you the topic for your book. Is this your first book?
It is my first book.
Yeah.
I went to school for nonfiction, and this is a hybrid memoir.
Okay.
It's about her, but it's also a little bit it's memoir, but there's a tiny bit of fiction, but the fiction in it is clearly fiction. Like you could, as you're reading, you can tell that but it's about her overdose and her life and the ways that I've come to find a relationship with her after she's died.
She know about your interest in writing?
As a kid, I always was writing. I was the kid that had like notebooks and I would just write stories all the time. And she would write letters to me too. She really liked to write. It was, I think we share that. And she was good at writing too. Like I was rereading some of her letters recently and I'm like, oh, she's she's really good at this. So it was funny. For one of my other projects I was working on in my freelance career, I went to a psychic that I found on TikTok and she has 3 million followers. Her name is Amy Bolesky. And I reached out to her PR team and I asked if I could see her because her whole thing is that she channels the dead. And
Mm.
I wanted to do an article on basically connecting with my mom and see what it was like to go to a psychic and have an experience like this. Because my mom was super spiritual. She was kind of a witchy woman. She would have absolutely loved if I went to a psychic. So I was like, this is fun. I'll do this and see what happens. So it was an hour session and it was completely accurate. She had no idea what my last name was. She had no idea that I was a writer. Just kind of, she didn't know anything about who I was trying to channel other than her first name. And she said about midway through the session, "Oh, your mom knows that you're writing a book about her." And she also said, this is so my mom, she was like, she knows you're writing a book about her. Um, and she knows that you're including pictures of her, and she doesn't like the pictures that you chose.
So did you
And
change the pictures after that?
no, I was like, she could deal with it. I think they're good pictures. I like them.
Aw.
Um, but it was like it was weird. I'm like, there's no way that she could have known this because I hadn't shared it publicly.
Was there anything else that she said to you through the psychic?
Did, and it was I mean, it was mind-blowing, honestly. She started the session by saying that my mom was showing my face crying, like really crying hard, and saying that I was in a terrible relationship and that I needed to leave. And she said that she sent my new husband to me because she knew that I was in a wrong relationship. She also said a bunch of stuff that was just like very spot on for her. An example, she said that she took janky medication all the time, and that's why she passed away. And that's
Oh,
true as well. My mom always had meth use problems, but she also used opioids constantly. I would say
okay.
even when she was clean, she was probably still abusing opioids, subtly, like no one knew about it. But she did have some illnesses and she was on a lot of medications, but then there was some stuff that she was using recreationally. And so the psychic was like, yeah, she's showing her taking a few pills and like taking meth. And I'm like, yes, this is like exactly how she overdosed. She ended up her exact like on the coroner's report was acute methamphetamine intoxication, which is just sudden meth intoxication. And
Oh, wow.
she had a bunch of other stuff in her system too that, maybe it was from the days prior, but, her heart couldn't take it anymore. And, I didn't tell the psychic any of this. She just like relayed this information to me, which was
Wow.
wild. And then she said some really fun things too. She said that I live in New York and that when you walk out of my apartment, you can see the city skyline. And that's true. Also, she said that she saw me coming home and putting my keys on the counter and that I would be saying hi to a wiry haired dog. What's funny is I've had this dream of getting a Brussels Griffon, which they're like little Ewoks. And I didn't tell anyone that I wanted this dog. And this was before I got him. I got him 2 weeks ago, or last week actually. And he's a
Oh.
wiry haired dog. So it was, there was some fun in there. There was also some humor. My
So it's
parents
like your
were,
mom knew what you were thinking because you said that you
yeah,
didn't really talk about it, right? Like,
yeah.
how could that be? I don't know. Like sometimes, like I'll talk out loud to my dad, but sometimes I do hope that he can hear what I'm thinking. But there's no way for us to know that.
I think I choose to believe they can hear and that they're around. There's
Mhm.
too many coincidences that I've seen that make me think that. Like an example is there's a scene in my book that I finished my last scene a couple of weeks ago, and it involves her overdose scene, and it's written completely in fiction, but I've used the police report, the coroner's report to kind of inform the scene. And one of the things that I made up in the scene was that she was looking for a lighter, like a big blue lighter in her purse. Because my mom was a big smoker. She always was, and she never gave up smoking. And it was so weird. I went to the thrift store a couple of days ago, and I was looking at a few bags, and I picked up a bag that I liked, and I opened it, and there was a blue Bic lighter in there that was broken. And I had written that she was like looking for a lighter and hers was broken. Yeah, so it's crazy to me. Like I think she appears to me in ways that
So
are
when
like,
did you write it? When did you write that?
I wrote that 2 weeks ago. It was the final thing that I had to finish for the book.
And then a
Uh,
week later,
yeah, it
wow.
happened.
I do see that sometimes, or I read that sometimes spirits will leave us like signs or show us
Mhm.
signs, and we don't know how the heck they're able to do it, but that's
Yeah, it's
very
I
spot
I
on.
just I came out at home and I was like, you'll never guess what happened. Like this is crazy.
Yeah.
And yeah, I find that happens all the time. And then, the psychic also told me things that she would say that my mom was telling her something specific, like in her voice. And when the psychic said it out loud, I would start laughing because I'm like, this is so her personality and so her voice. There's no way that someone could make this up. Like an example is my parents were not really together during my childhood. They had an on again, off again, very like up and down relationship, and they would fight a lot, but they were truly each other's soulmates, I think. And my dad was also a meth addict for many years, and he's been clean for 20 years now,
Oh,
which is
okay.
great.
Yeah.
Actually, I think maybe like 21 or 22 years now, but they met in the lifestyle. And my mom always said that my dad was a pain in her ass, which is like, just she would just say it and be like, oh, he's such a pain in the ass. And the psychic said that to me.
Oh,
Yeah, she's saying that your dad's a pain in her ass. I'm like, uh-huh. Yeah. So it just made me laugh. I'm like, this is great.
when your mom passed, do you know anything about how it happened, or do you know if she was alone?
She lived in a sort of halfway house for folks who were maybe terminally ill. And it's like a government aid program. And she was living there because my grandma was sick and she was taking care of her. They had a very codependent relationship. This is my grandma, my mom's mom. And I was also estranged from her as well because she was also doing drugs and not great to be around. And so they lived there together and they shared a room. And I think there was 10 other people that lived there who were all there for different reasons. And she lived in a nice house. It's crazy because I didn't know where she lived for many years. And it turns out that she lived down the street from my dad's house where I grew up.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. And I'm from a small town in California.
Does your
It's a
dad still
desert.
live over in that area?
Yeah.
Oh, so did he
Um,
ever see her, like around?
there was a few points where family members that live in the town saw her a few times, but I personally never saw her.
Okay.
And I later learned it's because she would hide from me when
Oh,
she would see me because she didn't want to approach me and upset me. And it's a very small town, so like there's no way that you couldn't run into someone that you know there. As far as her death goes, I learned kind of like your story. People try to hide the truth, especially from children. And I was 23 at the time, and I have a younger sister who's 15, and she's my full sister. And she doesn't really remember my mom very much because she was really young when she left our lives. The story that we initially heard from my grandmother, who's also not a reliable narrator, is that my mom had a heart attack in her sleep and had heart failure. I knew right away that that wasn't true, but I also knew that I would find out pretty immediately that that wasn't true. A lot of times, I tell people when I talk about this that addict behavior is to lie to protect other addicts or to lie to protect yourself. And in that way, my grandma was trying to kind of protect my mom's image. She didn't want us to think that my mom was using drugs. However, shortly after she passed away, my grandma called me the same day. And she called me maybe 10 times. And my dad was like, don't answer her. You don't need to deal with her right now. Because she's
mm,
very manipulative and has, it's just a complicated relationship. Like, you can't really trust the things that she says either. And she called, and I eventually picked up and we talked. And she was saying to me, oh, yeah, your mom died of heart failure. But then she said, it's your job to take care of her now. And I was like, what do you mean? And she said, well, the coroner said that you have to be the one to handle everything because you're her next of kin,
okay.
even though we were estranged for 11 years. What
Yeah.
I came to find out when I called the coroner and I called like crematories and everything is that it was not actually my role to do, but my grandma could not afford to do it. So she told me they're not going to do anything with her body unless you do. And at this point, I hadn't spoken to her for 11 years. So I felt like really overwhelmed in the first few weeks of planning funerals and planning the arrangements and doing all of the things. And I remember I called the coroner's office and I said, I told them my situation. And at first I was like, listen, I just want to get an autopsy report before I do anything further. Like I just need to know what happened to her fully.
Okay.
And they told me I wouldn't be able to get it because I didn't have proof that she was my mom because we had different last names. It was very complicated, and I honestly, when I talk about this, still makes me angry because I feel like the people who are working in the death industry are not very helpful. there's a lot of them that are, but these people that I worked with were really not, they were kind of rude to me throughout this whole
Mm,
process. And I was just trying to figure out what was going on.
yeah.
So I ended up, bringing my birth certificate to the coroner's office and demanding that they tell me what was going on and that they release her body in my name to, because we got her cremated to the crematory. Because otherwise, she would have ended up as something called indigent. So she would have been unnamed and unprocessed,
Okay.
and nothing would have happened to her other than being cremated, and she would have been put into um, a facility where they hold ashes that aren't um,
Claimed.
collected and claimed. So I was like, listen, I just need you to tell me what's going on. And my dad came with me, and my dad was very helpful throughout this process, even though it was hard for him to deal with too, because, they were soulmates and they didn't get to be together and their relationship ended very badly. He went down there and kind of helped demand that, like, we have some answers. And so they took me into a room and we sat down and they brought me a few of her belongings that they had. And they also brought me a few papers that they had. And then I had to pay, I remember I had to pay $25 in a cashier's check to get the autopsy report. Like, they don't let you pay by card or cash either. You have to pay by a check, a cashier's check. I'm like, this feels so archaic and weird. I'm like, why have they not figured this out already? So I go, I do the thing, and then they tell me I won't have the autopsy report for a few months.
Why?
It just takes long to process. And
Because
and
they had
and
already done the autopsy, right? At that point?
yes, but they
Oh,
wouldn't tell me that they did it. So I came to find out through research that when someone passes away, especially if they're at an early age and they have history of maybe drug abuse or something else, they'll do an autopsy, but they are not required to do an autopsy. It's up to the discretion of the coroner. And because of her age and her history, they decided to do one. But they wouldn't give me that information until I went in there and sort of demanded, like, hey, I'm her daughter. I'm handling this. I need to know. So I didn't actually know the true story until later. But I planned funerals, I did all of this stuff. And then, as grief does, life had to go on after all of this, and I was still really having a hard time. And I got a letter in the mail that said it was from the coroner and it was the full autopsy and it's very detailed. And what I learned from that was that she overdosed, and that was the only cause listed there. There was nothing about her heart. So, and I think my grandmother is very well aware that I know, but to this day, she holds her story that my mom died of a heart attack.
how did it go with your sister?
My sister had a very different experience than me because she didn't really remember my mom that well. My sister was 3 when my mom left. And so she has memories, but they're muddled and fuzzy, and she didn't really know her. And she also didn't have a lot of the terrible childhood experiences that I had from the drug use from both my parents. And in many ways, I'm sort of relieved for her to not have those experiences that I did firsthand.
Yeah.
But after her passing away, she acted like she didn't care at all. And then she got really angry, which is also natural.
All the different
And
stages.
yeah, but she really, I remember she was in high school. I think she was a freshman when my mom passed away. And I was out of college at this point, and I was married and had my life. And I remember she went to school the day that my mom passed away. She found out in the morning, and my dad said, you should stay home. And she said, no, I'm going to school. And she went to school and she sort of acted like nothing happened. But only in the past few years, she opened up to me and we have sort of grieved together in that way. My sister and I are 9 years apart, and we grew up kind of not liking each other very much
Oh,
because we're just a big age gap. But as we both gotten older, my sister's 21 almost now, we have a very good relationship. And part of that is in our grieving process and in talking about my mom. And I talk about my mom all the time now with her. I think it I think it gives her permission that I did not have when I was younger to say that I missed our mom.
and it gives her things to learn about her and different new memories that you can share with her.
Yeah, like it's kind of fun now because we both get emotional about the same things and we both acknowledge the good and the bad parts. And I think other people in my family are less inclined to be able to do that still. But there are people who have encouraged my sister. Like my aunt is, she grew up with me and she's really close to us. My dad's sister. My mom had no siblings except for a stepsister. When I was born, my aunt and her were very close because they were same in age and they used to hang out all the time and they were kind of like sisters. Like they would make fun of each other and just like give each other a hard time. And so they had a really good relationship. And I think because of that, my aunt has a less negative opinion of her overall than the rest of my family. And I visited recently and we were sitting at dinner and she looked at me weirdly. Like she kind of just was staring at me and looked at me weird. And I was like, what? And she said, you really, the more old you get, the more you look just like your mom. And I was like, oh, thank you. Like that makes me happy. And I see it in my sister too. Like she's starting to look like her. And sometimes she has mannerisms that are the same, even though we didn't get to have a childhood necessarily with her. I think that all helps my sister in a way.
Do you think that if your aunt was telling you that like 10, 12 years ago, you would take that differently?
Yeah, I think I would have been upset about it because I was upset about our relationship, you know?
Yeah.
I was upset about the ways that my mom was being. I didn't understand that addiction was a disease and not a choice. And that's something that I've really done a lot of unlearning on. The number one thing that I feel like people don't understand or can't understand because they're not in the addict mind is it's really not a choice. Yes, you make choices in your life, but at a certain point, you become so chemically dependent on something that you cannot function without it. I mean, my mom, her brain was not fully developed because she started using meth at 13 years old. And you
Wow.
actually, I don't know if you know this, but you get stuck a lot of times in the period that you started doing drugs. If you've done drugs for 10, 15, 20 years, a lot of the time your brain gets stuck into the same development place that you were in when you started. And that's something that I learned from my dad. My dad started using meth when he was 23 until he was 37 or 38, I believe. And my dad will tell you that even though he is almost 60 years old, he feels and acts like he's in his early 20s.
So, where do you think these stigmas come from? Do you think it's just because people don't understand, like how you were just explaining, how after a while it's not a choice anymore?
I think they're viewing it from a very human perspective, which is why can't this person just choose to stop? Why don't they love me enough? Why would they do such terrible things? And I think it comes from like the natural human brain, which is like to understand the motives behind something. And the problem is, addiction is not something that can be understood truly. It consumes anyone and that comes into contact with it. And it doesn't matter how rich you are, how old, how young, like addiction doesn't discriminate. And we want to view it from the outside if we're not addicted as a choice or something that we could easily stop if only we cared about our families, our friends, our lives enough. But it's not really coming from that. When you're in the addicted brain, you're not thinking straight. You're not thinking about yourself at all. The only thing your brain is thinking about is when can I get the next hit? How can I feel normal? I think people start out using drugs because of the high and they keep using because it becomes the only way that they can feel normal.
You grew up mostly with your dad and your grandma, your dad's mom. Did that help you a lot? Because was it something tough that you had to grow up knowing about your mom?
It did because my dad was also a meth addict and he was also in trying to get into recovery. There was a lot of stuff that you'd think I would have been sheltered from if he wasn't using drugs, but I still experienced a lot of what it was like to have parents who were addicted because he was still using throughout my childhood. And I'm very, very thankful for my grandma. We call her Granny because when things were at their worst, she really stepped in and took care of me. When my dad ended up going to rehab in 2001, I was in First Point. My dad had been arrested for drug possession and use and selling. And my mom was in and out of prison and off doing her own thing and would show up here and there, but didn't have custody of me. My dad had full custody of me from the time I was 4 onward. But as his disease progressed, he became worse and worse. And CPS got involved as they should, and they were going to bring me to foster care. And instead of me having to go live with strangers, my granny stepped in and took care of me while my dad got in recovery. My dad was very lucky. He is kind of a gold star in terms of recovery because he went in cold turkey and he never used again.
What does he
This is some,
attribute his success to, do you think?
I don't know what, well, he's told me in the past that he kind of attributes it to me because I was born when he was 30 and he had already been using meth for 7 or 8 years. And he met my mom in that scene and she had me. And he told me from the very moment that I was born, I gave him a purpose that he didn't have before, which was to care about something other than partying and his lifestyle and what he was doing. He always tells me that he would have died very young if I wasn't around. And when it came to him finally going to rehab, CPS had been involved for a while in our case, and he had
Okay.
done multiple court sessions. He pled guilty on multiple charges so that he didn't have to go to jail. And they told him, if you continue down this road, Hayley will not be yours anymore. We will take her away completely. And I think that that really motivated him in a lot of ways. However, I think there's another side to it, which is, and this is something I'm working on an article right now about this for Women's Health Magazine. Women and men experience addiction differently, and they also experience recovery differently. Women are actually statistically more likely as addicts to lose their support systems, their spouses, their children, their jobs, and they're also statistically more likely to not be able to return to society after they've gone to recovery because of the ways that society treats mothers and women who are addicts. And when I started researching into this, I saw a very big correlation in like terms of my dad versus my mom. My dad had all the same attributes of his addiction for a long time that my mom did. And still, when he recovered, he had a thriving business. He made a lot of money. He was able to buy a home, had the support fully of his family and friends. When my mom had the brief stint of pure recovery, she didn't have any of that. And she never held down a job truly. She was never able to get her foot back up again. And I think there's that kind of difference. She was never able to get back where he is, and I do think it's gendered and it's a societal thing.
What things come to mind that you see or songs you hear or anything that specifically reminds you of her?
Yes. So my mom loved Stevie Nicks, and her favorite song of all
Oh,
time is Landslide. Also, a song that's less known called Crystal. My mom we grew up like dancing to Stevie Nicks together, like when I was around. And especially during the time when she was clean, she always told me she wanted to go to a Stevie Nicks concert. It's just like whenever I hear that, I think of her. And when I planned her funeral, I actually planned two separate funerals for her. Planned a smaller thing at my dad's house for close family members so that we could really like talk about what we needed to say and grieve properly. But at her actual service, which was like public, so her friends and family and anyone else that wanted to come could come, we had a slideshow of her photos and we played Stevie Nicks for her there. And another thing is when I saw her for the last time, she gave me a gift. My mom was really big into like homemade gifts. She would go to yard sales or thrift stores or craft stores and make a gift that really felt personal. And she gave me this box and I didn't open it right then. And I just, for some reason, felt like it was going to be really special. And on the way home, I opened it in the car and it was a crystal that, like, those ones that you hang in a window and they sort of catch the light and they show a little bit of rainbow colors.
yeah.
So it was on this long clear string and it was a crystal on the end. And she gave that to me. I don't know what the purpose was for her to give that to me, but she gave it to me. And still to this day, I have it hung up with all of her stuff. I have sort of an altar in my home for her with her ashes and photos of her. And it's there. But what's really crazy is when I got married this past year, I went to go get my wedding dress, and I typically don't really like wedding dresses very much. I think like most of them are kind of like I don't know. They're like cheesy kind of. But I
Okay.
saw this dress on TikTok and I really liked it. And I went in and I was like, I'm going to try this on. And I tried it on and it was so beautiful. And I knew that it was the dress for me. And I tried on a few others and they weren't it. So the woman helping me said, by the way, every one of these dresses are special. They have something really unique on them that you won't have on any other dress. Like the designer made them that way. It was an open back and it tied up in the back. And she said, this is what is special about the dress. And she held it up. And on the end of the strings, there was two of those crystals. They looked just like the one that my mom gave me.
Oh my God.
It
It's like
was,
you
it was
guys are so connected.
Yeah, it's great. And I was just like, I like started sobbing. I'm like, the woman's like, are you okay? What's going on? I'm like, no, it's fine. I'm just, but then when I got married, I wanted to honor her in some way. And so we played Stevie Nicks and we had our whole time. And then we had in the centerpieces on the dinner tables, we had those crystals hanging.
Oh,
So I bought a few just to have around. And it was
yeah.
kind of a way of honoring her and also just feeling like she was there.
My dad loved Pink Floyd, and I've been to about four Roger Waters concerts with Pink Floyd. And one of them, I was 8 months pregnant. I didn't know I was going to be 8 months pregnant when I bought the tickets, but I was like, there's no way I'm missing this. And
Yeah.
every time I've gone to his concert, and I went to one with my mom, the seat next to me was always empty. And even
Mhm.
though, like, the stadium was packed and the venue was packed. The seat next to me was always empty, and I always felt like that's him. He's sitting with me because he'd never want to
Oh.
miss this. At
Oh,
least that's what I think.
absolutely.
Um,
I think that's true.
so if you could talk to your mom, like tell her something one last time or ask her something, what would it be?
I talked to the psychic about this as well, and I just said like my question to her really was like, what do you think my mom would say to me if we could talk again?
Oh,
And her response was, she feels like she has to take care of you now, and she's helping you through your life because she wasn't around in my real life. And I think that's true. But as I was writing this book, really my purpose for this was to find ways to connect with her and understand her in ways that I never got to while she was alive. And so I got to say a lot of things that I wanted to say. And one of the biggest things that I think is maybe controversial, and I think when people read it, they'll think it's controversial, is I had a moment of wanting to apologize to my mom. I don't think that either of us are the culprits of anything bad that happened, but I do know that even though I was a child, I felt sorry that she didn't get to have the experience that she wanted in her life. And she never had the opportunity through her own relationship with her mother to develop something healthy and strong. She had no idea what it meant to be a mother. She had me when she was, I think, 19. She had no idea what it meant to be a mother, and she tried her best. So I think for me, I would apologize for just not being able to see her clearly always, but also tell her that it's okay. Like I'm okay and that we are okay and that I never stopped loving her through all of this stuff, even if it was extremely painful and hard and just like sometimes the worst experiences I've had in my life. I think know that I wouldn't trade her for another mother in the world.
that's beautiful. And it's almost like you sound like the mother because you're telling her that
Yeah.
it's okay.
Yeah. And it's backwards, but it's also just how my life has been. I've had to find ways to cope with that. And I think she had to find ways to cope with her own situation too. And I've like definitely forgiven her for the things that she's done. And in some ways, I think maybe, I know that she didn't purposely overdose, but I do think that in some ways, maybe she's happier to be at peace finally because her entire life was extremely hard. Yeah.
And you've given her a beautiful gift because, in a way, you've helped to rewrite her story.
Yeah, I think it's my biggest goal in life was to, after he passed away, was to bring something to the table that didn't just feel like, oh yeah, my mom died of an overdose and was a drug addict, because she was so much more than that. And that's something I really care about is helping people understand that they are human beings. And no matter if they're homeless or end up in prison or end up overdosing or find recovery and live a long, healthy life with their family, there's a reason behind drug use. And there's a reason that she was able to live as long as she did. Because by most standards, like people who start using at her the age she did wouldn't have that same fortune.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing all that. Is there anything else or any advice you would give to other people who've lost a parent to overdose and maybe are afraid to talk about it or face it the way that you have?
Yeah, I think, number one always is I think professional help is needed. I only could have made it so far with talking to friends or, people that I could talk to in my family. The biggest thing for me was finding someone who was non-biased to speak to and someone who could really understand the psychology behind addiction, and also help me to get through the grief process. Because we don't just grieve their death, we grieve their life too in many ways. And it's a very hard and complicated grief process to do, especially for folks who are maybe dealing with active addiction consistently throughout their lives. It is like reliving disappointments over and over again and trying to understand them in different ways. And if anyone listening has lost someone, especially a parent, I think finding someone who can help. There's free resources out there. There's less expensive options like sliding scale therapy. There's platforms like BetterHelp, which are online therapy platforms. The other thing I would suggest, and that really helped me, is to find an outlet that makes you feel like you can connect to that story. For me, it was writing, but for my sister, she's an actress and a singer. And so she often plays music or does a scene, and maybe the scene isn't about overdose, but she can release some emotion there, whether that's painting or running or going to the gym or whatever you feel like you can do to get in your body and connect with those feelings. And then also finding a community of these people that have experienced it too, because it is, although the statistic is like 350,000 people, children have experienced deaths of their parents to overdose. I do think it feels very isolating and lonely. And if you can reach out to someone who also understands, or even read, like, some of the articles I've written, or read a book that has the same experience, it can psychologically help you to feel less alone.
I think what you said that's so powerful is you're not just grieving their death, you're grieving their lives too. Like, wow,
Mhm.
I never thought of it that way, but yes, it's so much more than grieving just the death. But thank you so much. This was wonderful, and your story definitely helped me. And your experience with the psychic, I want to do that now. So I'm
You
gonna look her
should.
up. Even if it's not with her, like I have some research to do, but I would love
Mhm.
that. Thanks so much to Hayley for sharing her story. I can't wait to read her book. Speaking to my life coach has helped me in so many ways to process the grief of my dad in a healthy way and empower me to speak more freely about it, even after all these years. His name is Brian Nandy, and his group helps people all over the United States. If you're interested in talking to somebody, you can get more info at bncounseling.com. The Kids of Overdose podcast is not sponsored in any way. Music and cover art is from Pixabay. Thanks again for listening to Kids of Overdose.